Today we're picking up with a specific study of Abraham's life. In our last class we did a bit of a survey looking at the reputation of Abraham. Abraham is the first of the patriarchs. His life record in Genesis extends from chapter 11 verse 10, where the genealogy that leads up to him begins, and extends to chapter 25 verse 10, where we have the first events taking place after his death. Abraham is the father of the Jews. He's the father of faith. He's the friend of God. Those are the things that we remember about him in general. Now today I want to focus on the chronology that the book of Genesis gives to Abraham's life. And I would like to divide Abraham's life into three basic periods that we can see from the scriptures. And I believe that there is something particular about each of these periods. I would like to say that the main periods of Abraham's life relate to his levels of obedience to God's already revealed covenant while he was still on earth. You can divide Abraham's life up several different ways. You can divide it up in terms of location. He started where? In Ur, and where did he end up? After that. Where did he die? Look at chapter 25. The last specific place that it describes Abraham as living is back in chapter 27. Okay, what did you say? Yeah, and but it doesn't say where he was living. It says that they buried him in Machpelah, which is Mamre. So he was born in Ur and he was buried in Mamre. But that chapter doesn't tell us where he lived. It says in chapter 24 that Isaac lived in the desert, verse 62, by the well Laharai, or whatever. In chapter 24 we have the story of Abraham sending out his servant to get him, but it doesn't say where Abraham, well, maybe it does indicate it.
It says it goes right back to another sin.
Yeah, but that's where he sent to get.
No, when he got Rebecca back, he came right to
Oh, yeah.
He was there. So what are they? Have been living in.
Okay, it's possible that that's an indication where he lived. In chapter 23 it says that he bought the cave in Mamre, or Hebron. Hebron is the more familiar name for that place. So he died in Hebron. But chapter 21 verse 33 says that Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. And if you look at that, the land of the Philistines was to the west and to the south of what is generally considered central Palestine. And a 3 days journey could have taken him from the west coast, or it could have taken him from down in the Negev. And tradition and this is one of the points of controversy between the Samaritans and the traditional Jews, was that the Samaritans believed that Abraham took a 3-day journey from somewhere, probably south, came up to Mount Gerizim and offered up Isaac. However, the Jews believed that he offered up Isaac on Mount Moriah, which is essentially Jerusalem. Right? Between those two sites, the holy sites, is of course, Abraham being the founder of the Jewish people and of the Samaritans, in a sense. This becomes a focal point of crisis in their theology, but it simply says that Abraham sojourned in the land of Philistines. Well, Beersheba was down in the land of the Philistines. So was Laharai, a well, down in the Negev. So you can trace Abraham's movements a couple of times. One time he went down to Egypt. Another time he went down to Gerar, which is in Philistine country. Right? Then we have him coming back. Where was the first place mentioned that he came to when he came into the land of Palestine? From Haran. It begins with an S. Shechem. Right? He came from Haran to Shechem, and then he just moved over a couple of miles to a place called Bethel. And these were central places in Abraham's life.
Bethel part of Canaan.
Yeah, it was just on the other side of the mountain.
By Aaron. I didn't know the city, but it's
Yeah, Shechem and Bethel are towns. All right, and these were significant places because at these places we find that Abraham offered up sacrifices to God. He worshipped God on not idols, on altars. He built altars in these places. And those are very significant places. So anyway, we weren't going to trace that this morning. I just wanted to familiarize you with it, that you can divide the major events in Abraham's life according to location. We're going to divide them in terms of periods, time periods. Right? The first 75 years of Abraham's life was spent in this town. Or if not in Ur, at least in Babylonia. Okay? His own country. He didn't leave his country until he was 75. Alright? And the last 76 years of Abraham's life, he spent in Philistine country. Right? And the middle 24 years of Abraham's life, which was the crucial period in his life, this is where he's in Canaan for the most part. Right? We know Abraham was 175 when he died. Right? So 75 and 24 is 99, and 76 is 175. Right? So these are the three major periods of Abraham's life. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So we don't know how old Abraham was when God appeared to him in Genesis chapter 12 and gave him the first promise. We know that he was in Ur. And so, as I said, the main points in Abraham's life, in his life chronology, relate to his levels of obedience to this original thing that God had spoken to him. And it's, the Abrahamic covenant, the first mention is Genesis 12, 1-3. This is the great shining star in Abraham's life. This is what divided all this stuff up. Yes. Let's read it. 12, 1 to 3. Now the Lord had said to Abraham. And notice the had said. Because if you're reading from chapter 11 into chapter 12, you find that Abraham is in Haran now. Right? As far as the story goes. By the end of chapter 11. And then you read, God had said, which means that he had said to him before he came to Haran, these things. And he told him there were three conditions for Abraham. What are the three conditions? First one? What's the first condition? Leave your country. Secondly? And thirdly? Alright, now, slight difference between your kindred and your father's house. For all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter which one you relate to which. But I suppose you could take them in order. The first period in Abraham's life is that God, it took him 75 years to finally fulfill the first condition. Right? Now, I don't know, maybe he was 50 years old when God had given him this thing. If so, it took him 25 years to get out. Right? He might have been 40 or 30. We don't know. Right? And then the next thing we read is that it took him several years to finally fulfill these other conditions of leaving Haran, leaving his father's house, and then leaving Lot, because that was his kindred, right? And it was only when Abraham actually did this that God began to develop and move Abraham in a concrete way toward the ultimate fulfillment of the provisions. See? Now, eventually Abraham did fulfill all of these things. He left his country, his kindred, and his father's house, and then God showed him the land. And then God began to make him a nation and began to make his own name great and began to cause him to be a blessing and so forth. All right? So let's look at it. Just erase this stuff here so I can make it a little bit plainer. All right? So from chapter 11, 31 to 32, we have a record of the first 75 years. And he goes here from Ur to Haran. And what we see here in this period of Abraham's life is partial obedience. He does leave his country. You might say, as Schofield does, that these are wasted years. Right? If you're familiar with the topography and the maps and so forth of this part of the country, you're talking about a tiny little country over here. Ur of the Chaldees is down here on the Tigris-Euphrates River. Haran is up on the lower arm on the Euphrates River, and so for Abraham to leave Ur and to travel to Haran, he's basically leaving his country, right? But he hasn't left his father's house or his kindred yet, because it's not until his father actually dies that he leaves, right? And so it was only here that Abraham has finally fulfilled the two of these conditions. And why couldn't Abraham have come earlier? Right? I think that's the significance of God telling us that he was 75. God doesn't disapprove of Abraham, but verse 4 of chapter 12 indicates that, finally he did it. Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. But then that additional phrase, and Lot went with him, is indicating something important. Partial obedience. All right. Now, the next 24 years of Abraham's life are recorded in Genesis 12:4 through chapter 20, verse 18. Chapters 12 to 20. And this period of 24 years shows us that Abraham finally and fully obeys God during this period of his life. And basically, the key word to this time in Abraham's life is the waiting years. What is 75 plus 24? All right? And so he's 75 when he leaves Haran. All right? And in this section here, we are seeing Abraham go from Haran when he's 75 to until the promise of Isaac. That's what that's what these chapters show us, the promise of Isaac. And we know that Abraham was 99 when God gave him the promise that Isaac would be born. And it's during this period of time that the dominant theme is waiting. Waiting. Now, we need to subdivide this into 3 parts. You can, anyways. Chapter 12, verse 4 to 16:16 covers a period of 11 years. That is, Abraham is 75. Chapter 12, verse 4, it says that Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. You come to chapter 16:16, the last verse of that chapter, and it says Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. So, within 11 years, he gives up waiting. And the end result of that is a fleshly seed, right? You all with me here?
2 of them, I think.
Good. There are quite a few important events listed in these 4 chapters. He worships at Shechem when he comes in. He worships at an altar in Bethel. Then he goes down into Egypt out of the land, and he gets a lot of money, but he also loses his testimony. He comes back to Bethel. He finally separates from Lot. See, we're talking about Abraham's finally and fully obeys God. He finally does this. When he does that, God reiterates his covenant with him. He worships at Hebron. He rescues Lot. He's justified by God, and Ishmael is born. Right? A lot happened in this 11 years. There is one verse there at the beginning of chapter 16. It says, let's read the first 3 verses of chapter 16. In the context, the whole of chapter 15 is God's reiteration of the covenant. I think God knew that Abraham was tired of waiting. All right? Because chapter 16, the first 3 verses tells us that he had been there 10 years, and that was the excuse that Sarah used to get him to go ahead and try some other scheme. Sarai, Abraham's wife, bore him no children. She had a handmaid and an Egyptian whose name was Hagar. Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord has restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go to my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And by the way, the archaeologists have discovered that the ancient code of Hammurabi describes legal describes laws whereby this was a legal way to get an heir if you were disgraced with not having your own son, your own natural son. You could consider a child, a male son through a slave, as your legal heir. You could adopt him as your legal heir. And so it wasn't just an immoral thing, but it was actually an accommodation. It was a compromise. That's really what it was in terms of the second history. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah, and Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to Abraham for his wife. After 10 years, see? So they got tired of waiting, and I think chapter 15 is showing us that God knew that they were just about going to do this, and so as if to keep Abraham from making a mistake, he reiterates the promise to him. Chapter 15, one of the major, restatements of the covenant. Then it took a year for, Ishmael to be born. Right? 9 months. Okay, so the first period is a sad period. Then the second division of this 24-year period is a 13-year period. I want you to know something here. From chapter 16, verse 16 to when do we have the next 13 years described? The next 13 years of Abraham's life are described in 0 verses. From the end of chapter 16, he's 86.
86, yeah. 16, yeah.
Right? And chapter 17, verse 1,
he's 99.
He's 99 years old. Nothing, absolutely nothing is told us about Abraham's life for 13 years. I mean, you talk about waiting for God to keep his promise. And they finally gave up and got a fleshly seed. What God was doing is growing this seed. More waiting. Longer waiting. And Abraham was watching his flesh grow up. You talk about wasted years. See? What would have been like in Abraham's life if he had simply waited? Perhaps God would have given him the next year. Instead of Ishmael being born in his in his 24th year in Canaan, or not his 20th, in his 11th year, maybe it would have been Isaac. And how different our world today would be if there had been no Ishmael. Because Ishmael was the child of the flesh, Isaac was the child of promise. Now Ishmael was the father of one of the patriarchs of the Arab nations, and Isaac is the father of the Jews. And there would be none of this Jew-Arab conflict, which is so crucial to the world today. So it's still to the world. It's kind of an interesting thing to postulate what our world would be like if Abraham hadn't done this. Anyway, he did. And then from chapter 17:1, and you'll notice that the scriptures put an emphasis on their own, what God thinks is important. From chapter 17:1 to chapter 20, verse 18, this last verse here, right here, we have the third period, and we're talking about Abraham going from his 99th year to his 100th year. We have 1 year. And in the space of this 1 year,
Sure gets in trouble, doesn't it?
oh my goodness, it's just amazing. 13 years are passed over in complete silence, and then we have 3 chapters devoted to this next year, the year in which the promise of Isaac was given and Isaac was born. Now in this 1 year period, some pretty dramatic things happen. God, in chapter 17, reiterates the covenant, right? And institutes the sign of circumcision. It's very interesting to note that Ishmael as well as Abraham was circumcised. And on the day that God reiterated the covenant, he told Abraham, your son is 13, but Isaac is the one that I'm going to keep my promise in. And Isaac is going to be your seed. Chapter 18, what's the story? Pardon?
Egypt.
No, not chapter 18. Right after that, Abraham's in his tent. Remember, the angels come and they say, again, for the second time, 2 chapters in a row, God promises Isaac is going to be born this time next year. So it was a year to the day. Right? Here Lot finally gets his due. Right? Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. Chapter 19, Lot finally apostatizes. He goes right to the end of his rope. And probably, I would say that it's not unlikely that the reason Abraham went, one of the reasons that contributed to Abraham's going down into Gerar, into Philistine country, was out of despair over Lot. Right? Like, what would cause Abraham to go down into Gerar in chapter 20, and to lose his testimony again, like he did, like he had earlier in Egypt? And so chapter 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had spoken, for Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Right? So we close with, we're still waiting, more waiting, and I think this is a pretty tough time in Abraham's life. He takes Ishmael down there with him. Ishmael watches his father make a fool out of himself in Gerar. Then chapter 21, verse 1 to 25:10 gives us the third and final period in Abraham's life. It describes a 76-year period.
It was, yeah,
So from the time Abraham was 75 until he was 100 years old, he's waiting for the seed to be born. Okay? Now, instead of waiting, he gets to watch. And here's the key word. This is my key word. In the last 76 years of Abraham's life, he gets to watch. He wasted the first 75 years of his life, sort of. The middle 24 years of his life, he was waiting. The last 76 years of his life, he was watching. Watching the seed grow. Watching the blessings multiply. Now, I'm going to have to rub some of this stuff off because I don't have room on the board. Are you done to hear? Okay.
I've done all this last night. There's a couple things I've overseen.
All right. The last 76 years of Abraham's life likewise divide into 3. We can divide them into 3. The first subdivision is his 137 years, which extends from the birth of Isaac. And how old was he when Isaac was born? When Isaac was born.
He was 100 years old.
Right? Oh, okay. I was slow this morning. How old was Isaac when he was born? He was 0. Okay, Abraham was 100. And for the next 37 years, that makes him 137, right?
Is that what? You got 10 for 12.
No, that's what it was 100 before.
Oh. Okay.
Okay, so Isaac is born at the beginning of chapter 21:1. And what happens when Abraham is 137? No. How old is his wife?
137.
She's 10 years younger, right?
Yeah.
She's 127, and that's how we know Abraham is 137, because it tells us in chapter 23, verse 1, that Sarah died and she was 127 years old. Okay? So for the next 37 years, you go from, there's several ways to divide this up. From the birth of Isaac to the death of Sarah. I'm not sure if this is the best way to divide it. This is what I did for starters. Okay. What does Abraham see during these 37 years? Like what are the most significant events that take place, or are there any significant events that take place during this period of time? There's only one significant event recorded, actually 2, but I'm not quite sure what the Beersheba episode shows. He had a fight over a well. What is Genesis 22 all about?
The opposite.
Yeah, he sees God protect the seed. He watches God protect the seed. This is one of the great manifestations of Abraham's faith, by the way. A very positive thing in Abraham's life. Abraham goes out with a flourish. You know, the first 75 years were wasted. The middle years were up and down. You know, he doesn't know what to do. He makes a bunch of bad mistakes. But boy, the last 75 years of Abraham's life, you don't read hardly anything bad. He goes out in a flourish. I mean, Hebrews chapter 11 describes this major event. You know, in these 37 years, the highlight was when God said, "Kill your seed." And Abraham believed that God was able even to raise him up from the dead. That's how much faith he had. Hebrews 11 tells us. You know, I mean, that's fantastic. Right? All right. In the 3 following years, which takes us from the death of Sarah when Abraham was 137 until the marriages of Isaac and Abraham.
Yeah, they won't get that.
Abraham's 140 when he gets married. He doesn't tell us that, but I'm assuming that it is. I think he got married the same year that his son got married. We know that Abraham was 140 when Isaac got married because it tells us that Isaac was 40 when he got married. All right? So that makes Abraham 140, right? And if you read chapters 23 to 24:67, if you read there, says, Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Go over to chapter 25:20. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife. Right? And then the next verse after it tells us that Isaac got a wife, it says, then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. So I don't think it's surmising too much that we can say Abraham was 140 when he got married. So, over a 3-year period, what happened during this 3 years? Chapters 23 and 24. What happened in 23? Any major events in chapter 23?
About the field, the grave.
Yeah, he bought a grave. That was significant, I suppose, physically, yeah. He was eventually buried with his wife, Sarah. Well, what does Abraham see in chapter 24? I mean, chapter 24 is the highlight of this period in Abraham's life. Yeah, so he doesn't see that. What does he see?
Oh, he's coming in life. Oh, you get home. Oh, you couldn't see. I'm gonna get my stuff together and take the stuff that's not in the stuff.
He sees God provide for the seed. Right away. Yeah, I asked you what happens in this 3-year period. The dominant thing was for God to provide a wife who was not one of the daughters of Canaan was a major thing to Abraham. Now, I don't know where Abraham got his wife. It doesn't tell us. You ever thought about it? Where did Abraham get his wife? Maybe it matters more that the young guys get good ones than the old guys get them. No, don't take that as serious.
What's the significance of the seed that was born on the second of that wife?
Okay, we're going to come to that. Right, the last period in Abraham's life is passed over in relatively little scriptures. There are 10 verses that cover the last 35. Is it 35? Yeah. He dies when he's 175. The last 35 years of Abraham's life are passed over in 10 verses. From 25:1 to 10. And we're talking about here from his marriage to his death. He's 140 when he gets married, and he dies when he's 175. What do you think it is that Abraham sees during the last 35 years of his wife? What do you think the significance of it is? What happens to him? He gets a wife and how many kids? Count them up. How many children does Keturah bear Abraham?